All right, well, in the first couple videos here, we've been exploring this whole idea of favoritism. We've seen that what favoritism is when we make judgments about people or assumptions about them and we treat them differently based on their external characteristics. And whether that be we treat them poorly because we deem them as lesser, or we treat people better simply because we esteem them more highly. Either way, the Bible calls it favoritism, and the Bible calls this evil. But maybe you're wondering, why is this such a big deal to God? Why is this sin of favoritism called evil? Again, like we said earlier, this doesn't seem on the surface like it's that big of a sin. So why is it such a big deal to God? And why does James make such a big deal about it? In fact, James is going to come back to this issue over and over again throughout his book. Well, fundamentally, here is the reason why it's a big deal. And it's because favoritism goes directly against the very character of God. Favoritism is the opposite of everything that God stands for. So demonstrating favoritism, it is completely opposed to God's nature. You know, it's interesting, outside this particular chapter in James chapter 2, this word favoritism, it's used only 5 other times in the New Testament. And in every other case where it's used, it is used to say that God does not show favoritism. Over and over again, it talks about this idea of favoritism that says God doesn't act this way. God does not show favoritism. Here's just one example. There's many, again, we could look at. Acts chapter 10, verse 34 and 35, it says this. It's talking about the apostle Peter, and he's giving a sermon, and he says this. Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and do what is right. You see, Peter was addressing the whole idea of the common notion in his day that people thought that the Jewish people had a special connection with God and that really only they could be uniquely in relationship with God. And Peter says, no, that is favoritism, and God does not do that. God accepts people from every race, from every nation. And again, we see this idea repeated multiple times in the New Testament. In fact, every other time this word is used is talking about God. And so the New Testament wants us to understand this very important idea that God is no respecter of persons. That's kind of an old-fashioned phrase, but maybe you're familiar with it. That means that God is not impressed by us. And also, on the other hand, he is not turned away by us. He's not impressed by or turned away by our outward characteristics. God is no respecter of persons. And instead, what we consistently see over and over again taught throughout the Bible is that what God is concerned about is our heart. God isn't concerned about our status, about our money, about our ethnic background, about any of those external things. What God cares about is our heart toward him. There's a great picture of this in the Old Testament in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16 and verse 7. The context of the story is they are deciding who's going to be the next king of Israel. And the young man who is brought forth to be king is David. But David, it turns out, really wasn't that impressive of a young man. He was sort of the youngest of the family. He wasn't the one that you would expect based on outward circumstances to be chosen as king. But to that, the Bible says this in verse 7. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You see what it's communicating there is that God understood the heart of David and that David had a passion for God, and that's why he was chosen to be king. It wasn't because of any outward thing, it was because of his heart. And that should teach us that when God deals with us, it is not based on anything external, it is based on the attitude of our heart. And so what does that mean for us? Well, remember what the Bible teaches us in the book of Ephesians chapter 5 in verse 1. It says that as Christians, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love just as Christ also loved you. It says when you think about the character of God, that is important to us because we are to imitate his character. That is the example, the type of character we want to emulate in our lives. So if we discover that God is radically opposed to favoritism, we should be as well. As imitators of God, we shouldn't be concerned about outward things. We should be concerned about the heart. We shouldn't make judgments on people based on their externals. We should love all people just like Christ loved us. So let me encourage you now just to go ahead and pause and think about this really practical question. How can you do this? Understanding God's character, God's heart. How can we practically be imitators of God when it comes to avoiding the sin of favoritism?